Hi folks, this is Luke Hauser, author of Direct Action, an historical novel. That's me in disguise back in the day. I'll be narrating this history of nonviolent direct action from the American Revolutionary period up to the present. This show was created in connection with directaction.org, where you'll find a free download of my book and links to the print edition, as well as organizing resources and incisive social commentary. See the links below in the description. And now, one person's version of A Brief History of Nonviolent Direct Action. What is nonviolent direct action, you might be asking? It's more than protesting. It's more than working for change or impacting the world in some fashion. I would say that it's any action we take that seeks to directly create the world in which we want to live. This could be as simple and mundane as volunteering for a youth gardening program, or as dramatic as being a nonviolent peacekeeper in Palestine. Sometimes we fall into regarding only take-it-to-the-streets type actions as direct. In fact, any time we undertake to make change ourselves, rather than delegating it to an authority or lobbying the government to solve the problem, we're taking direct action. Direct action through American history. Direct action has a long and well-documented history in this country. Some famous examples are the Boston Tea Party and the entire American Revolution, the Underground Railroad, the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, labor and union organizing, indigenous uprisings at Wounded Knee and Alcatraz, the feminist movement, the gay rights movement, cultural organizing such as the Beats and Hippies, Food Not Bombs, Seeds of Peace, and other guerrilla kitchens, and anyone who has ever stuck a flyer on a telephone pole. Why direct action? Why take direct action? Many people watching this slideshow already know that we can't expect the government, corporations, banks, boards of regents, and other institutions to initiate change. It's not a question of electing better leaders. It's the nature of these institutions to uphold the status quo. The most we can expect is that they can be pressured to ratify rights that have first been won in the streets. This has been true of the rights of unions, women, people of color, gays and lesbians. The list goes on and on. Unless people who care about the world take direct action and make change ourselves, as in these photos from Occupy Oakland in 2011, there's no pressure on the government to do anything besides serve the rich and powerful. This is not an argument against all government. We need government institutions to back up the hard-won victories of direct action. The civil rights and labor movements achieved great gains, but at some point it was essential to nail down the victories in concrete legislation. This is the pattern of social change. It's won in the streets and ratified in the halls of government. Nonviolence, peaceful power. The development of direct action in the U.S. has witnessed increasing emphasis on nonviolence. For earlier movements such as the American Revolution, the abolitionist movement, and union organizing, violence was seen by some as part of an overall strategy for change. More recent efforts have moved toward a commitment to nonviolence. Sometimes this grows from a spiritual practice, and sometimes it reflects a personal commitment to principles of love and unity, as with hippies or ravers. Nonviolence can also be used to unify diverse communities in mutual trust and respect. In the 1980s anti-nuclear movement, all participants were expected to take a nonviolence prep and to make an explicit commitment to the nonviolence guidelines, which ban not only physical but also verbal attacks on opponents. While some protesters strongly held these as core values, others merely adopted them for a single protest. The guidelines served as a basis of trust and unity, so that strangers winding up in the same blockade line or jail cell could count on a certain level of agreement on tactics and behavior. The 1970s, a period of ferment. We'll return to the anti-nuke movement, but for a moment let's flash back to the 1970s. The Vietnam debacle wound down by 1975. In the aftermath of the top-down, cis-male-dominated organizing of the 1960s, the 70s saw a breakthrough for women's rights and gay rights in the U.S. and in Europe. Both movements emphasized small groups, consensus, non-hierarchy, and a focus on interpersonal relations, issues that became central to the direct action movement of the 1980s. A second response to the mass protests of the 1960s was a new focus on decentralized direct actions in the later 1970s. Protests were organized by loose networks with no central leadership. Small affinity groups made their own action plans within guidelines agreed upon at representative spokes councils. These lessons began to pay dividends as protests against nuclear energy in Europe and on both U.S. coasts resulted in hundreds and even thousands of arrests in the later 70s and early 80s. Europe in the 1970s and 80s. Under the impetus of President Reagan's re-escalation of the Cold War, protesters in Europe in the early 1980s turned their focus from nuclear power to nuclear weapons. This was a pivotal inspiration for anti-nuclear activists in the United States. Marches in the Netherlands and Germany drew hundreds of thousands of people to protest the arms race. These European marches were among the largest in the world during the 1970s and 80s. Here, thousands of protesters march at Comiso, Sicily, near a U.S. military base. Activists in Germany and England also protested outside U.S. bases. In these years, the peak of the Second Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the U.S. had over 100,000 troops stationed in Europe, along with hundreds of nuclear warheads. German protesters staged die-ins outside U.S. bases, often blocking movement of U.S. troop convoys rumored to be moving nuclear weapons. These colorful actions were very influential. Activists from the U.S. traveled to Germany and England in these years and took part in such actions, bringing lessons back home. Not all lessons were transferable. Police tactics in Germany were different. Where U.S. authorities generally arrested protesters with varying amounts of force, German authorities sometimes used water cannons to drive protesters out of the roads. These images give some sense of the European backdrop to what would soon unfold in California. That's the end of Part 1 of A Brief History of Direct Action. Stick around for Part 2, where we'll carry the story through to the present. And now, intermission.
We are sweet water and we are the sea. We are the storm winds that blow away greed. We are the new world we bring to birth. A river rising to reclaim the earth. We are sweet water and we are the sea. We are the storm winds that blow away greed. We are the new world we bring to birth. A river rising to reclaim the earth. We are sweet water.
And now, back to our story. The 1980s, an explosion of activism. The 1980s were the era of Reagan. Unrestricted military spending and nuclear sword rattling, economic oppression and the birth of modern homelessness, ecological devastation, and a surge of activism. Thinking globally, acting locally was a favorite slogan of the day. For us in the U.S., what it meant was an awareness of the impact of Reagan's military program, the impact on the Europeans who were the likely first victims in any conflict with the Soviets, and the impact on poor and working people in our own country and around the world, who saw social services ignored to pay for military buildup. Marches were taking place in the U.S., but where the European marches numbered in hundreds of thousands, their U.S. counterparts were generally far smaller. It was a depressing time. Reagan was elected in 1980, and the rise in the military budget and in homelessness was massive. The careful diplomacy of the Nixon and Carter years gave way to a swaggering bravado. The Soviet Union was labeled the evil empire, and limited nuclear war was seriously discussed as a policy option. This is Hiroshima, August 1945. Hiroshima was at that time a city about the size of Oakland or St. Louis. People around the world were feeling like something had to be done. Let's take a closer look at what was happening in Northern California. Livermore Nuclear Weapons Lab. Design and production of U.S. nuclear weapons has always been shrouded in secrecy. It wasn't until the 1970s that the role of the University of California and Livermore National Laboratory became clear. UC manages the Nevada Nuclear Test Site and the country's 2 nuclear weapons design labs at Los Alamos, New Mexico, and at Livermore, California. Between them, the 2 competing labs have created nearly every U.S. nuclear device since 1950. Protests around nuclear issues were happening in California and on the Upper East Coast during the later 1970s. A 1981 protest at Diablo Canyon Power Plant in California resulted in nearly 2,000 arrests. During the 4 days the protesters spent in jail for that action, Bay Area organizers spread the word about meetings that fall to plan a direct action at Livermore Lab. Small protests were already happening at the lab, including Advent and Holy Week actions by Christian affinity groups, who were among the most active at that time. Here, Christians take to the streets with props at a Good Friday action. A Christian affinity group demonstrates 1980s lockdown technology, which has come a long way since that time. Meetings in fall and winter 1981-82 led to a series of nonviolent blockades at Livermore Lab. Before these actions, small affinity groups took part in day-long activism preps, role-playing possible actions and jail scenarios. A diverse crowd of over 5,000 people, including members of the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, showed up at the lab on summer solstice 1982. And thousands more took part in other protests over the next several years. Buddhist monks were among hundreds of faith-based protesters. Quaker, Unitarian, Jewish, and pagan affinity groups were active, including founding members of the reclaiming tradition of magical activism. Parents and kids bring poignancy to anti-nuclear and anti-war organizing. Among the several thousand people arrested at Livermore in 1982 and 83 were dozens of young people. Arrestees under 18 were taken to juvenile hall, booked, and released to their parents or guardians. A few managed to hide their age and were jailed with the adult protesters. Here's a typical blockade scene. The nonviolence guidelines say that we will not use verbal violence, which reduces the confrontational tone found at many protests. Some people sang, some chanted. Some lectured the cops about the arms race, while others pleaded with them to stop protecting nuclear weapons. Many protesters accepted arrest and cooperated with police. Some refused to cooperate. This was considered an individual choice, and blockaders consented in advance to hold solidarity with anyone non-cooperating to make sure they did not get additional resisting arrest charges. Sometimes police would drag non-cooperators, but often they would use pain compliance holds, pressure points, and wrist locks. A number of people using wheelchairs were arrested in the blockades and were jailed with the rest of us. People using wheelchairs were as likely as anyone to non-cooperate. A strange footnote. The big June blockades were far too large for the Alameda County Jail. In 1982, we were held in a warehouse and gymnasium on the jail grounds. The next year, they knew we were coming, so they rented striped circus tents and set them up on the jail grounds, where they held us for an average of 10 days in miserable conditions. Needless to say, people were happy to get out of jail. San Francisco, nonviolent urban actions. In 1983, anti-nuclear protests moved to downtown San Francisco, doing walking tours aimed at exposing and disrupting nuclear contracting corporations, banks, and federal offices. Although numbering at most only a few hundred people, the city protests were more disruptive and confrontational than the Livermore blockades had been. A younger crowd took part in city protests, including several punk affinity groups. Die-in tactics imported from Europe snarled city streets. Protesters would die in the street, and when cops arrived, people would get up and meld into the crowd, reappearing a block or two away to die again. These tactics, used in the 1980s by protests of 100 to 300 people, blossomed years later at the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle in 1999, and again in San Francisco during the anti-war protests of early 2003, when thousands of people used mobile tactics to shut down the financial district. Peace camps in the U.S. and Europe. As I mentioned at the top, direct action is not simply about confronting police and getting arrested. A powerful alternative is peace camps. Encampments were part of many anti-nuclear direct actions, such as those at Diablo Canyon Nuclear Power Plant and Vandenberg Air Force Base in Southern California. An older activist once told me that he thought the original inspiration for peace camps came from Woodstock, getting back to the land. In England around 1982, in response to the U.S. military bases in that country, activist women organized an ongoing peace camp at Greenham Common, site of a U.S. base. Thousands of women took part in gatherings and actions at Greenham Common. On January 1, 1983, about 60 women cut through a security fence and danced on a missile silo. The camps at Greenham Common and elsewhere inspired California activists to organize a peace camp at Livermore Lab in spring 1984. People from the camp would leaflet at the front gate each workday. Shown here are copies of the Peace Lab News, a series of leaflets used during the peace camp. When I first heard talk of a peace camp, I pictured a row of tents along the highway. Instead, it looked like a new subdivision was going in. Here's the first meal at the peace camp. Although not a direct influence, the spirit of these camps was captured again in the Occupy movement of 2011, when people camped in city centers across the U.S. to demand social justice. The 1980s anti-nuclear movement used a variety of approaches: nonviolent blockades, confrontational city protests, and peace encampments, passing these tactics as well as a general strategy of direct action to subsequent generations. Gradually, the focus of organizing shifted and broadened from nukes to intervention in Central America and the Middle East, anti-war demonstrations, the massive protests against corporate globalization at Seattle in 1999 and beyond, and on to today's social and environmental justice organizing. Direct action today. The 1980s anti-nuclear movement represented a peak of direct action organizing, bringing the lessons of past movements such as civil rights, feminism, and gay rights into the mainstream of social organizing. From that base have sprung many movements of recent years. A short list includes huge encampments and civil disobedience actions against nuclear testing at Nevada Test Site, where activists built links with indigenous people from the Shoshone Nations. People taking to the streets to stop environmental destruction. Protests of military intervention in the Middle East, Central America, and elsewhere. Groups like Food Not Bombs, ACT UP, and Queer Nation have expanded the focus of direct action. Earth First and other groups have organized tree sits to stop clear-cutting of old-growth forests. And thousands have participated in the movement to stop corporate globalization, including the uprising in Seattle in 1999. All of these movements, particularly the largest at Seattle in '99 and during anti-war protests in 1991 and 2003, relied on the lessons of earlier movements, using affinity groups, consensus, and mobile street tactics to shut down entire business districts. Nonviolent direct action is not a piece of dusty history, but a living tradition. What's next? The most encouraging sign I see is the increasing diversity and interweaving of movements, such as Black Lives Matter, Occupy and social justice organizing, solidarity actions initiated by Indigenous people, street theater dramatizing our sense of urgency, and the amazing leadership of a new generation of young people with groups like Extinction Rebellion, Sunrise Movement, and Youth versus Apocalypse around issues such as climate justice and gun control. On the front lines, blockade and lockdown tactics continue to evolve, and people seem as committed as ever to holding their ground, whether in the streets or in the trees. Awareness of the global political and ecological situation is light years ahead of where we were in the past, especially awareness of the pivotal role of economics. Anti-war and globalization protests are sure to continue, but just as important are direct actions that bring our activism right into our home communities. Projects like farmers markets, needle exchange, info shops, and community gardening. Keeping on, keeping on. And so we ask ourselves, what impact do we actually have? What effect does direct action, and particularly nonviolent civil disobedience, have on our world? Sometimes the results of direct action are dramatic, an end to segregation or to the construction of a nuclear power plant. Other times it's more subtle, a shift in public awareness, a space created for discussion of alternatives. For many of us from the olden days, our number one goal was and remains preventing nuclear war. So far, so good. Which brings us to the crucial role of keeping a sense of humor. Here's a few examples. Kami Dupe's affinity group put up 300 copies of this realistic-looking poster in BART commuter trains. Some were defaced by people who took it seriously. In 1982 to 84, people organized the Berkeley Anti-Reagan Festival, BARF, as a way to protest Reaganism without endorsing the Democrats, who were, after all, voting for all of Reagan's military budgets. Coma Affinity Group, the Committee of Militant Artists, built this mobile Diablo Canyon reactor for a Berkeley Earth Day parade. Members of Coma also helped form the band Funky Nixons, veterans of 1,000 benefits, give or take a few. Here they sing with Wavy Gravy at Berkeley's People's Park. Graffiti artist Apollinaire painted this mural in one night on a South Berkeley wall. In this Tax Day skit, a group of waiters approached outdoor cafe patrons in San Francisco, presenting them with a tray of toy soldiers and missiles. They'd ask, "Did you order this?" When the patrons shook their head and said no, the waiters would hand them a bill for $300 billion, the annual defense budget, and say, "Well, you're paying for it." Last but not least, here's Coma Affinity Group again with the first version of their mobile nuclear missile. The missile, which weighed several hundred pounds, was carried by a crew of 4 to 6 people through the streets of San Francisco. And here we have the final version, the Nukesicle, complete with 4 motorcycle wheels, a steering wheel, and brakes. The Nukesicle had a long and colorful career recounted in my novel. I won't give it away here. But as you can see, someone had a dream, and they worked to make it real. A question. We're left with a question. How are we making our world a better place for ourselves and for future generations? The challenge is to address immediate social needs while ultimately creating the world we want to live in. Building that world is truly the meaning of direct action. Thanks for tuning in. See you in the streets. Don't forget to visit directaction.org, where you'll find links to buy my book or download a free PDF of Direct Action, an historical novel by Luke Hauser, as well as my other books, and all sorts of organizing resources. You'll find links below in the description. And visit weaveandspin.org for dozens of chants for activism, circles, and singing in the shower. weaveandspin.org. Links below in the description. Ciao for now.